Prepare yourself for a journey through war and adventure. Follow Fitzroy Maclean as he takes you to the guerrilla battlefields of Yugoslavia. These are his words. Let's begin. Despite his experience at Drvar, Tito had not lost his liking for caves. On Vis, he discovered 1/3 of the way up Mount Hum, which rose stark and barren at one end of the island, and there installed himself. I, for my part, chose a little house by the water's edge, which, though strategically less well placed in the event of an enemy attack, was a good deal more commodious and boasted the best bathing on the island. Swimming out a little way, you could see, as you lay floating on your back in the clear blue water, the whole panorama of the Dalmatian coast, stretching hazily away into the distance, with the sunlit island of Korčula, now in German hands, standing out in sharper relief in the foreground. Sometimes Tito would come down from his mountain to visit me, and we would swim out together, with Olga, Tigger, and the bodyguard cleaving the water in perfect formation behind us. Vis itself had undergone a startling change since I had last been there. In the place of the peaceful little Dalmatian island, with nothing more warlike to show than the crumbling battlements of Fort St. George, a veritable military, naval, and air base had sprung into being in the space of a few months. In the central valley, the olive trees had disappeared, and the red earth had been flattened out to form a full-sized landing strip, from which fighters and fighter bombers were constantly taking off on their way to attack shipping up and down the coast or objectives inland. On one side were drawn up sometimes as many as a dozen 4-engined American bombers, fortresses and liberators, which had run into trouble while on operations over the mainland, and, unable to get back to their bases in Italy, had limped as far as this and crash-landed on Vis. The narrow roads were crammed with army trucks and jeeps, stirring up clouds of red dust as they rushed along. Every few hundred yards, dumps of stores and ammunition, surrounded by barbed wire and brightly painted direction posts, advertised the presence of REME, NAAFI, DADOS, and the 101 other services and organizations whose very existence we had forgotten in our year away from the army. From the surviving olive groves, the old familiar bugle calls rang out, and through the branches, we could see the green berets and khaki drill of Tom Churchill's commandos as they moved about, making ready for some raid on the mainland or a neighboring island. Down by the harbor at Komiža was the naval headquarters, presided over by Commander Morgan Giles, Royal Navy, who had what was practically an independent command over a considerable force of motor torpedo boats and other light naval craft, with which he engaged in piratical activities against enemy shipping up and down the whole length of the Yugoslav coast from Istria to Montenegro. Though Morgan Giles possessed the high-sounding title of Senior Naval Officer, this, or, in its abbreviated form, SNOVIS, his assistants, for reasons which will be obvious, were known as the Seven Dwarfs. The island boasted another even more distinguished sailor, not to mention, for the moment, the partisan Major General who commanded Tito's fleet of schooners. No account of events on Vis would be complete without some mention of him. Admiral Sir Walter Cowan had, after a long and distinguished career, retired from the Navy in 1931, at the age of 60. In 1939, on the outbreak of war, he had managed to get himself re-employed, and, not wishing to stay at home, he had himself sent out to the Middle East, which he felt, offered more scope to a man of his tastes. He had always enjoyed fighting on shore, preferably hand-to-hand, as much or more than fighting at sea, and had won his Distinguished Service Order in the Sudan serving under Lord Kitchener in the 1890s. Accordingly, at the age of 70, he attached himself to an Indian cavalry regiment serving in the Western Desert, with the rank of Commander, Royal Navy, and in the somewhat ill-defined position of Naval Liaison Officer. In this capacity he took part in a number of commando raids, startling all concerned by his complete disregard of danger. But in those days, things were not going as well as they might in the desert, and one day the party he was with had the misfortune to be completely overrun by a strong force of German tanks. Admiral Cowan was last seen advancing sternly on one of the enemy's tanks, discharging his pistol at it from point-blank range. Last seen, that is, until, having escaped from his prison camp, he appeared a year or two later in Italy and immediately attached himself to Tom Churchill's Commando Brigade. Those of us who had known him in the desert were delighted to see him reappear on Vis, as frail-looking, as dashing, and as friendly as ever. There he was to end the war, adding, at the age of 73, by his gallantry on a raid, a bar to the Distinguished Service Order which he had won half a century before. With the arrival on Vis of Tito and his staff, a German attempt to capture the island once again became a probability, and we lived in a state of constant preparedness. In the event, no such attempt was made, largely, I think, because of the disrupting effect of the successful harassing operations carried out by the British forces based on Vis, acting in cooperation with the partisans. These showed great aptitude for small-scale raiding and were able to give valuable support to the commandos, whom they furnished with much useful local information. They also used their rather ramshackle old schooners to extremely good effect, employing them not only as improvised landing craft but actually engaging and sometimes capturing enemy vessels with them. In these operations, a not unimportant part was beginning to be played by partisan artillerymen. These were the product of an institution known, somewhat grandiloquently, as the Balkan School of Artillery, which had been set up on Vis as part of my mission under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Cupp, Royal Artillery, a regular soldier of great patience and unflagging good humor, whose life's work it became to instruct the partisans in the use of the American 75mm pack howitzer. This was a light mountain gun, transportable on muleback if there happened to be any mules, and in general ideally suited to the type of warfare in which we were engaged. After a certain amount of preliminary argument, an unavoidable accompaniment of any enterprise of this kind, the partisans took to the new weapon like ducks to water, operating the relatively complicated sighting and range-finding devices as if they had done nothing else all their lives. Eventually, a whole battery was trained and, after being successfully tried out on a number of raids, was landed by air, complete with guns and some extremely lively mules, in the heart of Montenegro, a ticklish operation, which, however, was abundantly justified by results. At about the same time, the Royal Air Force carried out in the same area what must have been one of the most remarkable air operations of its kind. I received from my mission with the Montenegrin partisans a signal to say that they were hard-pressed by the enemy and that their movements were severely hampered by the large numbers of wounded which they had with them. At once, the Royal Air Force agreed to help. The wounded, numbering close to 1,000, were concentrated near an improvised landing strip, and one summer afternoon some 30 sorties were flown by troop-carrying Dakotas, and every one of them was evacuated under the nose of the enemy. This was only one instance of the constant help of all kinds which we were now receiving from the Royal Air Force. The proposal to set up a special Royal Air Force formation in support of the partisans had now been put into execution with the creation of the Balkan Air Force under Air Vice Marshal Elliott. Headquarters Balkan Air Force was responsible for the planning and coordination of all supply dropping as well as for all bomber and fighter operations in support of the partisans. This gave me a single authority with whom I could deal directly, and was of incalculable advantage in obtaining quick results. I was lucky, too, in having Bill Elliott to work with. His quick intelligence and ready imagination were essential qualities in dealing with so volatile and uncertain an element as guerrilla warfare. He, in turn, was responsible to Air Marshal Slessor, another outstanding airman, who, despite the innumerable other calls on his attention, was always ready to interest himself in our affairs and come to our help in time of need. This represented a marked change from the situation which I had found when I had first approached the problem of helping the partisans a year earlier. Then, such supplies as were available had been dropped, and air support had been given as and when opportunity offered. Now help came in a steady flow in accordance with a carefully worked-out system of priorities, while tactical and strategical air support was promptly given wherever it was most needed, and a signal to the Balkan Air Force could be counted on to produce immediate results. Help on such a scale played a decisive part in enabling the partisans to withstand the fierce onslaught with which the Germans had followed up their attack on Drvar. Like the preceding 6 offensives, this 7th offensive, as it came to be called, gradually petered out. Once more, the partisans had succeeded in denying the enemy a target at which he could strike a decisive blow. Now, after waiting for their adversary's assault to spend its force, they themselves were ready to assume the initiative once more. Just as we had helped, by well-timed air support and supply drops, to relieve the pressure when the partisans were on the defensive, so, now that they had passed to the attack, we prepared once again to back them up. Meanwhile, on other fronts, things were moving fast. In Italy, Rome had fallen, and the Eighth Army stood before Florence. In the west, the Allies had landed in France and had fared better than anyone had dared to hope. In the east, the Russians were advancing rapidly in great bounds, rolling back the Germans towards their own frontiers in the north and, in the south, pushing down towards the Balkans. By the summer of 1944, the end of the war in Europe at last seemed within reach, or at any rate within sight. Nor was this without its effect on our relations with the partisans. The increased speed of our advance northwards up Italy made it more necessary than ever that our operations should be closely coordinated with theirs. It seemed possible that, as things went increasingly badly for them, the Germans would decide to withdraw from the Balkans altogether. If so, it was most important that steps should be taken to cut off their retreat. We had also to consider what would happen when the Allies and the partisans joined hands in northern Italy. Tito had already told me that it was his intention to lay claim to Istria, Trieste, Venetia Julia, and part of Carinthia, and the Allies, so far as I knew, had as yet no definite policy with regard to these areas. Finally, there was, once again, the political problem. The probability that Yugoslavia would before long, by one agency or another, be freed from the Germans made it desirable to reach without delay some kind of compromise that would enable us to reconcile our de jure obligations with the de facto situation which existed inside the country. Tito's presence on Vis, a couple of hours' flight from Caserta, the new seat of Allied forces headquarters, seemed to offer an excellent opportunity of reaching a direct settlement with him, and I had not been on Vis long when I was instructed to extend to him an invitation to visit Italy as the guest of the Supreme Allied Commander. Tito accepted, and, after much discussion, an agreed program was drawn up and a date fixed for the visit. The night before, General Wilson sent over his private airplane to Vis to fetch us, and in this, we made the flight to Naples. Tito was accompanied by his chief of staff and various other leading members of his entourage, by Olga, by his medical advisor, and by his bodyguard. It seemed hard, in the circumstances, that the dog Tigger should be left behind, and, at my suggestion, he was brought too. It was thus a considerable party that came tumbling out of the plane onto the sun-baked expanse of Capo di Chino Aerodrome. The cameras clicked and whirred. General Gammel, representing the Supreme Allied Commander, saluted, smiling affably. The Guard of Honor presented arms. Tigger barked, and Tito, returning the salutes, stepped with admirable composure into General Wilson's magnificent car, with its blonde Women's Army Corps driver at the wheel and, preceded by outriders on motor bicycles, was whisked off up the hill to Caserta, where he was to lunch with the Supreme Commander. It was his first public appearance outside his own country. There were not more than half a dozen of us at luncheon in the little dining room of General Wilson's hunting lodge up behind Caserta, and even so, there was very little elbow room. But this did not deter Bosco and Prilia, Tito's two bodyguards. Pushing their way past the Italian mess waiter, one took up his position immediately behind the marshal's chair, while the other kept General Wilson covered with his submachine gun. Tigger went to ground under the table. There was a slight atmosphere of constraint. It was unbearably hot. One could feel the sweat trickling down one's spine. Nobody said anything. Everyone, you could tell, was trying to think of a suitable opening gambit. We were spared the trouble. The strain of passing the vegetables, under the baleful eye of a heavily armed and extremely grim-looking guerrilla warrior, who clearly did not like Italians, was too much for the Italian mess waiter. With an exclamation of despair, he let a large dish of French beans drop with a crash on the table, and, at once, pandemonium reigned. The trigger fingers of the bodyguard twitched menacingly. Tigger, roused from his uneasy slumbers beneath the table, let out a long wolf-like howl and started to snap at everyone's ankles. The Italians chattered and gesticulated. For a moment, the situation showed signs of getting out of control. It was then that General Wilson started to laugh. Gently, almost silently at first, and then more and more heartily, until his whole massive frame quaked and rocked. Mirth bubbled in his eyes. I have never known anyone with a more infectious laugh. In a flash, Tito was guffawing too, and soon the whole table was convulsed with merriment. Even the Italians sniggered nervously in the background, while a grim smile spread over the stern features of the bodyguard. All tension disappeared. From then onwards, I could tell that, socially at any rate, the visit was going to be a success. I realized, too, that his gift for putting all around him at their ease was one of the Supreme Commander's most valuable assets. On the whole, the staff talks, which we started next day, went smoothly. In addition to making a careful joint study of the existing strategic position in the areas with which we were concerned and of the way in which it was likely to develop, a good deal of time was devoted to reviewing the supply position. Tito, with an eye, I think, to the future, took this opportunity to ask for the immediate delivery of some tanks, to be landed at some point which the partisans were temporarily holding on the coast of Montenegro, and it was only by taking him to see the colossal 8th Army tank maintenance workshops at Naples, employing some 12,000 workmen, that we were able to persuade him that the maintenance of an armored force would be rather beyond the Army of National Liberation under existing circumstances. On the other hand, we were able to give a good report of the progress of the partisan tank squadron which was then being trained in North Africa. Our conversations had been in progress for several days when the Supreme Allied Commander sent for me and showed me a most secret telegram that he had just received. It was from Mr. Churchill, announcing his own arrival in Italy in a week's time, and asking that Tito should, if possible, be induced to prolong his stay in Naples for a few days so that they might meet. Things would have been much simpler if we could immediately have informed Tito of the contents of the message. But this, on security grounds, we were not allowed to do. We had to invent one pretext after another for spinning out the staff talks, though we had already exhausted almost every subject that we could usefully discuss, and Tito was beginning to show signs of wanting to go home. There was, we hinted darkly, someone else who wanted to see him. Time hung heavy on our hands. I took Tito to see General Alexander at his camp beside the lake at Bolsno, where, for the first time, the question of Trieste was raised. I took him to Rome, the first big town he had been in for 3 years, where his new marshal's uniform and the Tommy guns of the bodyguard, stacked neatly on the steps of St. Peter's, caused a mild sensation. I took him to see what was left of Anzio and Cassino. I took him to tea with Hermione Ranfurly at her ridiculous little house on the side of the hill overlooking the Bay of Naples. I took him, as the guest of General Bill Donovan, to Mrs. Harrison Williams's villa at Capri. It was there, as we were sitting under the trees in the garden eating lunch and admiring the incomparable view, that we became aware of a roaring in the sky. Looking up, we saw, high above us, the clumsy form of a York with a dozen fighters weaving and diving around it, like porpoises around a whale. Tito took it all in at a glance. "Here," he said, "comes Mr. Churchill." He was not an easy man to keep anything from. The Naples Conference, as it was afterward called, was, so far as it went, a success. The two main protagonists, Mr. Churchill and Tito, got on well enough with each other. The Prime Minister was staying at a villa which had once been occupied by Queen Victoria, and there, surrounded by fusty enormities of Italian 19th-century taste, we sat closeted for hours in the sweltering heat of the Neapolitan summer, Mr. Churchill and I on one side of the table, Tito, Olga, and Velebit on the other. When we knocked off, it was to take part in official and semi-official banquets, freely interspersed with speeches, all requiring translation. The Prime Minister had no intention of allowing himself to be kept to any fixed program, and the range of questions we covered was wide. Yugoslav resistance had long been a subject for which he had a special predilection. Now he was allowing himself the luxury of handling it personally, across the table with the guerrilla leader himself, specially brought there for the purpose. He did it extremely well, with a touch that was generally light and friendly but sometimes heavy with the accumulated dignity and wisdom gained by 40 years of experience in the affairs of state. He was generous in his praise of Tito's leadership and in his recognition of the partisans' contribution to the Allied cause, generous, too, in his estimate of the help they would need to achieve the liberation of their country and to rebuild it once the war was over. Over military matters, he took Tito into his confidence, calling for maps and showing him, with appropriate gestures, how, in his view, the war would develop. Even now, from where we sat by the open windows, we could see the ships gathering in the Bay of Naples for the forthcoming invasion of southern France. On the subject of our obligations to King Peter, Mr. Churchill was quite frank. He made it clear that we could not accord the partisan regime any kind of political recognition unless they came to some kind of arrangement with the king. Finally, while saying or doing nothing that might be interpreted as undue interference in the internal affairs of another country, he managed to include in his remarks certain counsels of moderation. One, I remember, concerned the collectivization of agriculture. "My friend Marshal Stalin," he began, and I could see Tito sit up a little straighter at the mere mention of the name. "My friend Marshal Stalin told me the other day that his battle with the peasants had been a more perilous and formidable undertaking than the battle for Stalingrad. I hope that you, Marshal," he added, "will think twice before you join such a battle with your sturdy Serbian peasantry." I watched Tito to see how he was taking it all. He was, I think, impressed. It would indeed have been surprising if he had not been. For him, it was a big moment. Here he was, the revolutionary, the outlaw, against whom every hand was turned, honorably received by the highest in the land and dealing on equal terms with one of the big three. But he had the strength of character not to allow any feeling of triumph or elation to show or to affect his conduct, which remained moderate and unobtrusive. Was he perhaps for a moment tempted to consider the possibility of coming to terms with the democracies, of opening a window on the Occident, of trying to keep in with the West as well as the East? It seemed unlikely but just conceivable. Sometimes, when questions of detail arose, Others would be called in to take part in the discussions. Once or twice matters were referred to a committee of experts, while Mr. Churchill and Tito rested from their labors. On one such occasion, a question of supply was being discussed by the chiefs of staff, when it was found that no further progress could be made without first referring the matter to the Prime Minister. But no one knew where the Prime Minister was. In the end, someone remembered having heard him making plans to go bathing in the Bay of Naples. The matter was of some urgency, as a decision was needed at once, and I was accordingly instructed by General Wilson to go and find him and bring back his answer. The Americans furnished me, in case of need, with a stenographer, a blonde young lady of considerable personal attractions wearing a closely fitting tropical uniform. The Royal Navy gave me a motor torpedo boat, and, thus provided, I set out. The first thing that we saw as we emerged from the harbor into the wider waters of the bay was a great fleet composed of innumerable ships of every size and shape steaming majestically towards the open sea, evidently the first phase of the invasion of the south of France. This complicated my task. Trying to find Mr. Churchill in the midst of this mighty armada was like looking for a needle in a haystack, and, to make matters worse, the captain of the MTB, a very young and somewhat diffident officer of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, showed, quite properly no doubt, the greatest reluctance to risk his craft anywhere near these great convoys as they went sailing past. Disconsolately, we chugged along in the general direction of Capri. It was then that we noticed something unusual was happening. As we watched, one of the troop ships slightly slackened her speed as if to avoid something. Simultaneously, there was a burst of excited cheering from the troops on deck, and a small bright blue object shot across her bows. On inspecting this through a pair of glasses, I recognized it as the Admiral's barge, and there, standing by the coxswain, wearing a boiler suit and a broad-brimmed Panama hat, smoking a cigar and giving the V sign, was the object of my search. As we still watched, he swerved out and round and disappeared behind the next ship in the convoy. Clearly, there was nothing for it but to give chase. I put this to the captain. He did not like the idea at all. It was all very well, he said, for the Prime Minister to go swerving in and out of convoys. But if he did it, he would get into trouble. I said that I would take full responsibility. At this he brightened, and, having once taken the plunge, acquitted himself nobly. With the sea foaming and frothing in our wake, we set out boldly on our erratic course down the line. As we passed them, the troops on the transports gave an extra cheer for luck, followed by a salvo of whistles as they spotted my female companion. I have seldom felt more conspicuous. Eventually, we overtook and headed off the blue barge. There followed an intricate boarding operation in a choppy sea, and I landed precipitously at the Prime Minister's feet, while the stenographer, anxious to miss nothing, hung over the rail of the MTB. Mr. Churchill seemed keenly interested. "Do you," he asked, "often spend your afternoons careering around the Bay of Naples in His Majesty's ships with this charming young lady?" In vain, I explained the object of the exercise. I was not to hear the last of this episode for some time. They were an exhausting 10 days, and I was relieved when they came to an end. But our excursion into high politics was not over. Already, before his talks with Mr. Churchill, Tito had had a number of preliminary conversations on this with Dr. Ivan Subasic, who, since I had seen him in London some weeks earlier, had emerged as Prime Minister of a new Royal Yugoslav government, formed for the specific purpose of coming to terms with the partisans. As a result of these, a preliminary understanding had been reached, providing for a measure of cooperation between the royal government and Tito's National Committee. Now, Dr. Subasic flew back to Vis in the same plane as Tito and myself, and the conversations were resumed. Vis became a hive of political activity. In all these conversations, neither I nor Ralph Stevenson, who, as British ambassador to the Royal Yugoslav government, had accompanied Subasic, took any part. It was a purely Yugoslav occasion. Ralph, who was an old friend from Foreign Office days, and I spent our days bathing in the warm sunlit sea and speculating as to the outcome of the negotiations. Would agreement be reached? Would Tito consider it worth compromising with the Royal Yugoslavs in order to gain Allied recognition? Would any terms that he was prepared to offer be acceptable to Subasic? Would he consider himself as bound by any agreement that he might reach now, once the country was liberated and he held all the cards in his hands? Might not the Russians suddenly take the wind out of our sails, in any case, by recognizing Tito independently of the Americans and ourselves? It was hard to say. Rather belatedly, the British government had done what they could to bring the two parties together. Now they must wait and see what came of it. One thing was certain, At this late stage, Tito, with so many cards in his hand, was unlikely to give much away. From time to time, the two parties would inform us of the progress they were making. It sounded, and was, too good to be true. The solution towards which they were moving was, it appeared, on the following lines: Tito's government and Subisic's government would be merged into a single provisional Royal Yugoslav government, which would continue in existence until Yugoslavia had been liberated, and free, popular, democratic elections could be held. Thereafter, it was presumed, the people of Yugoslavia would be governed by whatever type of government they chose for themselves and would live happily ever after. On the strength of it, Tito took the whole party out in a motorboat on a picnic to a local beauty spot, a great subterranean, or rather submarine cave, which the sunlight, striking through the water which filled it, suffused with a blue phosphorescent radiance. Entering the cave in a small boat, we all stripped and bathed, our bodies glistening bluish and ghastly. Almost everyone there was a cabinet minister in one or the other of the two Yugoslav governments, and there was much shouting and laughter as one blue and phosphorescent excellency cannoned into another, bobbing about in that caerulean twilight. Then we emerged once more into the sunlight and sea breezes and lunched off lobsters and white wine. It was choppy going home, and several of the party were sick. Not long after, Dr. Subisic returned to London to lay before King Peter the results of his talks with Tito. That concludes the 20th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.